Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you also for not going through my full-length biography. Sometimes can be a bit embarrassing, especially when the speaker says at the end, and in addition to all these accomplishments, he also has an excellent sense of humor, which then of course puts me in an extremely awkward position because I cannot possibly rise to that high standard, right? Thank you for not doing that. All right. Tonight I'd like to divide my remarks on three major areas. First of all, I'd like to pose the question, how serious is the problem of income inequality in the world today? And in doing so, inevitably, I will have to tell you a little bit about how we economists measure inequality and what are some of the metrics and the indicators and the data that we look at to basically discuss this issue meaningfully. Then I would like to, in the second part of my presentation, I would like to pose the question, why is it that the elimination of income disparities, the reduction of the extremes of wealth and poverty is such a fundamental principle within the Baha'i teachings. And then finally, what I'd like to do in the third part of my remarks is to offer some solutions. As it turns out, especially Abdul Baha, who was the head of the Baha'i community between the years 1892 and 1921, especially during a period of about a year when he was traveling in America, in 1912, he came to the issue of inequality repeatedly in many of his public presentations, and he offered some interesting, provocative solutions to address the problem of inequality. And of course, inevitably, I will also talk about solutions from the perspective of organizations such as the one I work for, the World Bank, academicians, and other people who are giving increasing attention to this subject, because it really has acquired such prominence and has people worried all over the world because of the deteriorating trends and the very sobering statistics. So let me begin. Inequality is actually a fairly technically complex subject. It is mired in controversy at times. Partly because different people mean different things when they talk about inequality. An expert, a journalist, somebody giving an interview on television may be talking about inequality, and he may be thinking in his own head that he's referring to inequality between countries. Right? And that is certainly one legitimate way to look at inequality. It turns out, however, that it is possible to talk about inequality within a country. In other words, we can say Brazil has at the moment 213 million people, and we can ask the question, how is income distributed among these 213 million people? Right? So that's a second measure of inequality, a second concept. And the metrics that are used are a little different. And then finally, a former colleague of mine at the World Bank, Branko Milanovic, who is one of the world's leading experts on inequality, he talks about world inequality. He says, no, let's abstract ourselves from national boundaries. Let's not think of Frenchmen and Germans and New Zealanders. Let's think of the world as one common home with 7.5 billion people, and let's ask the question, how is income distributed among these 7.5 billion people? And then he comes up with some metrics that look at that particular measure of inequality. So as you can see, there are many different ways of looking at this. What complicates the debate very often, especially at the level of lay persons, not experts, not economists, not civil servants working with UN agencies, is that very often there tends to be a kind of a confusion between the concept of inequality on the one hand and the concept of poverty on the other. It is, however, possible for us to make improvements in reducing poverty while at the same time inequality worsens, which is in fact what has happened over the last several decades. So to begin with, let me just share a little bit about poverty. Let me spend 2 or 3 minutes sharing with you some of the latest data that we have on poverty. And you will see why I will do this in a couple of minutes. If you talk to your finance minister who may have just returned from the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Indonesia, you may hear him say that the World Bank says that we have made very important progress in reducing extreme poverty. And if he remembers the numbers that he heard at many of the meetings that he attended to, he might even quote them to you and say, according to the World Bank, in 1990, there were nearly 2 billion people living or characterized as extremely poor. And so you immediately ask him, what do you mean by extremely poor? And he will tell you, the World Bank defines somebody to be extremely poor if they have an income of less than $1.90 per day, right? And you might say, oh, that seems like an incredibly austere poverty line. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to live on $1.90 per day, right? And the answer to that question is yes, it is a very austere poverty line. Even so, in 1990, which is not so long ago, there were 2 billion people in the world living under $1.90, right? But then he will say, the World Bank says that today, there are less than 800 million people living on less than $1.90 a day. And that is why the bank is saying that we have made dramatic progress, because to come down from 2 billion to less than 800 million is progress. And you will say, yes, I think that is correct. However, it turns out that the data is complicated. And if you begin to dig in a little deeper, you begin to get a kind of a more nuanced picture of what has happened to poverty in the world. First, much of that reduction from 2 billion to a little less than 800 million people in the last 25 years is actually China. It is to a great extent China, to a lesser extent India, but overwhelmingly it's China. China has been growing very quickly, double-digit rates of growth for the last 20, 30 years, and along the way it has pulled out hundreds of millions of people from extreme poverty. If you actually look at the data from Africa, there has actually been an increase in the number of poor people in Africa during the same period, right? So that adds a bit of nuance to the story about the reduction of poverty over the last 25 years. There is a very prominent American economist who says that if you push the poverty line from $1.90 to $3.20, which is just a little bit higher, not so much more, just a little higher, it turns out that those 800 million people all of a sudden become 2 billion people. In other words, if you define poverty to be income less than $3.20, there are something like 2 billion people today living on less than $2, right? Which means that there are a lot of people concentrated in that band between $1.90 and $3.20. And then my final point, and I promise you this presentation is not just going to be about figures, but the final point, which is made by Nancy Birdsall. Nancy Birdsall is a very prominent American economist who actually spoke at our home a couple of months ago. And she says, if you raise the poverty line a little higher to $5.50 per day, then 48% of the world's population lives under that poverty line and can be characterized as poor. She says, an income of $5.50 per day is an income where people struggle. If the husband loses his job, then they're in a very precarious condition, literally overnight. And so I mention these things to you just so that to underscore the point that we still face fairly important challenges in poverty alleviation. And the reason I mention this is because I will come to some of the Baha'i writings on the question of poverty as well in a few minutes. Now, inequality is a different concept altogether. And what I like to do is give you 3 examples, 3 metrics, 3 ways of looking at inequality, very different one from the other, just to give you a sense of what has happened to inequality in the last couple of 100 years, right? Now, you are familiar with the concept of the gross domestic or the gross national product, right? It's basically the goods and services, the value of the goods and services produced in a country in a given year, right? If you look at all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, close to 50 countries, and you add up their gross national product in the year 2016, it comes to a little less than $1.5 trillion. Right? And the population of these countries is close to 1 billion people. It's a little bit less than 1 billion people. Right? Okay, just keep those figures in mind for just 1 second. Then let's do the same with Switzerland and the Netherlands, two relatively smallish countries in Europe. One a member of the European Union, the other one not. It turns out that the gross national product or the gross domestic product of these two countries is roughly equivalent to the entire sub-Saharan Africa continent, $1.5 trillion. Except that, whereas the population of Africa is close to 1 billion people, the population of Switzerland and the Netherlands is 25 million people, which is about 2.5% of the population of the entire African continent, right? So these numbers, give you a fairly dramatic example or illustration of how income is concentrated, very unevenly in the world, to the point where two smallish countries in Europe actually generate the same level of wealth or income as the entire continent of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So this is one kind of very telling statistic. Another one, which I think is also fairly dramatic. Incidentally, economists and economic historians, have sort of looked at the evolution of income, over the last couple of hundred years. Branko Milanovic, in particular, this former colleague of mine at the World Bank, who's now a professor at the University of New York, he has looked at, for instance, what has happened to income in the rich countries and in the poor countries over the last couple of hundred years. And what he has discovered is that if you lump together the United States, Canada, the countries who are now members of the European Union, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, which is essentially the OECD, it's sort of the wealthy countries in the world today. And if you ask yourself, what has happened to average income over the last couple of hundred years in these countries, it has grown by about 20 times. 20 times. The rest of the world, that means my part of the world, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and so on and so forth, their income over the last couple of hundred years has grown by about 5 times, right? And so this suggests that there has been a massive process of divergence. If you go to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and then you basically differentiate these two sets of countries and you launch them for the next couple of hundred years, by today, 2018, there has been a huge divergence. The countries that were rich then have become incredibly richer today. The others have fallen behind. They have improved, but not to the same extent. And this is one of the problems that we face, and I will come back to this in a couple of minutes. A second illustration, I'll give you 3. This is the second illustration, is you do the following exercise. You go to 1820, which is the early period of the Industrial Revolution, and you look at the data that you have for about 26 countries then, mostly high-income countries, but plus a few others. And you ask yourself, pick the richest of these countries and pick the poorest. And ask yourself, how much richer is the richer country than the poorer country in terms of average income? And it turns out that ratio is 3, right? So essentially, back in 1820, the gap between the richest and the poorest was not that big. It was 3 times. So 3 is significant, right? Then you jump ahead and you pick the year 1992 and you ask yourself, what is that ratio? The ratio of the income of the richest to the income of the poorest. And that turns out to be 72. And then you say, what is that ratio today? 1992 is not so long ago, right? Just around the corner. We all remember what we were doing in 1992, with a couple of exceptions, I guess. But today, that ratio is 141, right? And it is widening, and it will continue to widen in coming decades. Right? So that's the second example I wanted to give you, just to highlight, what has happened, in terms of this process of divergence. The third illustration is just a tiny bit more complicated, but I'll sort of explain it to you. A former colleague of mine at the IMF, where I used to work long ago, wrote an opinion piece, an op-ed in the Financial Times. It must have been 3-4 years ago. And the title of the op-ed caught my attention. He's a very competent economist, and the title was "The Golden Age of Growth." And so I read it with interest, and the thesis of the article was actually a very simple one. I'm not trying to trivialize the thesis, really. I'm just summarizing an 800-word article in a few sentences. But basically what he was saying is that, look what's been happening in the last 20 years. The rich countries, like New Zealand and France and Germany and the United States, have been growing much more slowly than the poor countries in Africa and in Latin America and other places. In fact, broadly speaking, the poor countries have been growing at twice the speed of the rich countries. And that is why the article was called "The Golden Age of Growth," because he says, we have solved the problem of inequality. This is exactly what we need, is we need the poorer countries to grow more quickly than the richer countries, so that eventually they catch up. And that was the end of the article. And then, of course, being an economist, and having been working in this area for a long time, I said, and how long will it take for that catch-up process to take place, right? I mean, that's obviously a question that most people would ask, right? It is one thing to say the poor countries are catching up, but I think that if you're going to be honest with your readers, you also want to say, and I think that the catch-up process will take, whatever, 20 years, 25 years. So, to cut a long story short, I got a couple of my research assistants at the bank to work on doing a simulation so that we could get a sense of how long this process would take. And the results were really very sobering, essentially because, and these are the features of the exercise. You just say, what has been happening during the last 20 years? And you discover that in the last 20 years, the high income countries, the rich countries like New Zealand, on average, the whole set, has been growing at 2.6% in real terms per year, right? Whereas the poor countries have been growing at 4.7%. So this is the point that he was making in his article. Right? So it's broadly corroborated by the data. The poor countries have been growing twice as fast as the rich countries, right? So what you do then is you do a little very simple exercise. You say, okay, let's assume that for the foreseeable future, this continues, this process continues. That's a working assumption, of course. There are many reasons as to why this may not happen in practice. For instance, climate change, so the scientists are saying, are going to affect the poor countries especially so because they depend on agriculture, and agriculture is going to be very much affected by climate change. So these rates of growth of the poor countries, in fact, may slow down in coming years and decades. But to abstract from that, just let's do this arithmetic exercise. It turns out that the gap, which is large to begin with, the average income, the average per capita income of the rich countries today is $41,000, right? The average per capita income of the low-income countries is $600, right? So there is already quite a big of a gap between these two sets of countries. What do you think happens when you do this simulation and you assume these rates of growth for the next several years? What happens to the gap between $41,000 and $600? It turns out that the gap widens. And you might say, well, why? Why does it widen if they're growing more quickly, right? Why does it widen? And the answer to that question is that you are applying 4.6% to $600, but you're applying 2.7% to $41,000. And if I offer you, what's your name? Huh? All right. If I offer you, what would you prefer? Would you prefer that I give you 2.5% of $41,000 or 4.5% or 4.7% of 600? What are you going to answer me? Well, if you have not failed arithmetic in primary school, you will say, oh, I'd rather have 2.7% of $41,000, right? That number is much bigger, obviously, right? Because it is being applied to a much bigger base, right? And this is the reason why in the following years this gap widens and widens and widens. Now, how long do you think it widens? Well, it widens until roughly the end of the 23rd century, and then there is a catch-up within a few decades thereafter, right? So, if I am the finance minister of Sierra Leone, or Burundi, or Ghana, or Haiti, or one of these low-income countries, and you are a mother, a boater who comes and talks to me and says, you know, I have aspirations for my children. I would like my children to have the same opportunities and the same access to education that children in Sweden and Germany have, which I am very familiar with because I watch television, because the internet is available to me, and so on and so forth. What do you think that I can answer as a finance minister of Sierra Leone? Can I tell you, well, you know, just be patient. All you need to do is wait until the 23rd century, and by then, you know, we will have caught up, and, you know, you will say, no, thanks very much. I don't think I will wait. I think I will pack up, and I will migrate, legally or illegally. And that, you know, behind many of the problems that we have today of migration and these large movements of people, yes, there is a political component when it comes to Afghanistan and Syria and so on, but a lot of the migration is basically precipitated by people making that calculation. Maybe not as explicitly as I have made it to you, but intuitively they feel that this catch-up process is going to take a very long, long time. Right? And what happens, of course, is that the people that have already migrated, what do you think they tell the mother here in Sierra Leone or in Ghana? Well, they tell them about the benefits of having migrated 10, 15 years ago. The data suggests that people who migrate to Germany, to Sweden, to the United States, and to other countries are actually better off. They improve their average income. And so one of the problems with rising income inequality is that it produces incentives for people to want to move to other places in search of better opportunities. Okay. Incidentally, there is this Canadian professor, his name is Thomas Homer Dixon. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. Very, very insightful, very thoughtful man. And I think it was about 10 years ago, he wrote a book called The Upside of Down. And in that book, he did an exercise similar, you know, with different figures, obviously, as the one I have just explained to you about, you know, the high-income countries and the low-income countries. And he pointed out to the readers, look, you know, this process of convergence takes forever. And then he called that the dirty little secret of development economics, right? In other words, it's something that these development economics know, but they don't really like to talk about it, because if they really talk about it, what sets in is disappointment and a little bit of desperation on the part of the mother in Africa who wants to send, you know, who wants to provide her children with opportunities. Okay, now, enough for numbers for now. Let me turn to the second part of my presentation and raise the question, why is it that this issue was so pressing and so present, especially in the talks that Abdul Baha gave in North America in 1912. Let me share with you something that he said in Cleveland on the 6th of May of 1912. Abdul Baha, the head of the Baha'i community at that time, he was traveling in Europe and in America, essentially taking the message and the teachings and the principles of his father, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, to audiences everywhere. So he was speaking at universities, he was speaking at synagogues and churches and scientific societies and the home of, you know, private individuals. He gave a talk at Stanford University in October of 1912 before 2,000 students, administrators, and faculty. When I read a transcript of that presentation in my teens, I was, you know, completely overwhelmed by the thought and the concerns that were expressed at that time, especially on the question of peace and security and the future of humanity. But in Cleveland in 1912, he raised the issue of, he referred to the New Jerusalem, which is apparently a phrase that appears in the Bible, this concept of the New Jerusalem. And he asked, what does the New Jerusalem mean? And then he gave that concept an interpretation, and he said that it is essentially a reference to a readjustment of the economic order that will come about in the future. And he goes on to explain specifically that it refers to a narrowing of income and differentials and a reduction in the extremes of wealth and poverty. So that is the interpretation he gives to this term in the Bible, the New Jerusalem, right, as something new that will come. And he says it is specifically a reference to the social and economic order. And I think that I will share a couple of other quotes from the talks that he gave around that time as he was traveling in America, but one of the reasons I think that he felt the need to come to this issue repeatedly during his travels was that in 1912 there were very high levels of poverty in North America. It's true, by the early part of the 20th century, the United States was already emerging as a global economic power, but it was still in a context of, poverty and limitation. When were pensions and Social Security introduced in the United States? Did people have pensions in 1912? Was there Medicaid? Was there Medicare? Was there a safety net in place that had been put by the government to protect the people when they lost their jobs and so on? No. The answer to these questions are no. It was Franklin Roosevelt 20 years later in 1932 with the New Deal that brought forward, partly to address the calamity of the Great Depression, that brought forward initiatives of social protection and social security and the idea of, he said, liberating people from want and from poverty and so on, right? So back in 1912, as Abdu'l-Baha was traveling in America, he was aware that if somebody lost his job, his children might not have something to eat the following day, right? Yes, there was, of course, a middle class, and there were, wealthy people, but the financial condition of the vast majority of Americans in 1912 was quite dire, right? And I think that is why he came back to this message repeatedly, and why that message resonated very powerfully with his audience. In a few weeks later in New York, he said, one of Baha'u'llah's teachings is the adjustment of the means of livelihood in human society. There can be no extremes in human conditions as regards wealth and sustenance. He's saying we have to reorganize our affairs, we have to reorganize our forms of governance in a way that will reduce these income differentials. In Philadelphia, in June of that same year, all of these are from the summer, as he was traveling, he said, it is of the greatest importance, that is, reducing income inequalities, as it ensures the stability of the world. In this talk in Philadelphia, he brought in another idea. He was arguing for reducing income differentials as a way of improving the lot of the underprivileged, the downtrodden, the people at the lower end of the income scale. But he said there is yet another reason why you need to address this problem, and it is that if it is allowed to continue, if it is allowed to widen, if these extremes of wealth and poverty become worse and worse, it will undermine the security of the world. Now, that to me is very sobering, because he was speaking in 1912. 100 years later, has income inequality improved or worsened? It has worsened dramatically, much more so, right? And it seems to me that today we're beginning to see in many parts of the world, the early evidence, of the instability that can come as a result of, these widening differentials, through the rise of populism, through the emergence of demagogues in different parts of the world, who tell the voters, you vote for me and I will fix your problem, right? And then only disappointment follows afterwards, of course, because they have no idea how to solve the problem, right? In New Jersey, around that time, to be precise, May 19, 1912, this is yet another interesting angle on the issue of income differentials. He said, the rich are deprived of eternal happiness, for eternal happiness is contingent upon giving, and the poor are everywhere in a state of abject need. And then he says, you know, rich people, they suffer the burdens of wealth management. Being rich, he said, is not such a bed of roses. They're constantly worried about, you know, losing what they have accumulated by, you know, honest or dishonest means. Right? And he said, poverty is not just low income. I'm paraphrasing. Poverty is not just low income. Poverty often brings with it stress and suffering and misery. And so he refers to the psychological aspects that poverty brings about, right? It's not just that if you're poor, you don't have, you can't afford, you know, the same luxuries of the rich. No, poverty with itself brings, you know, lack of freedom. It brings stress. It brings suffering. It brings, you know, it has a kind of a psychological dimension to it that we cannot ignore. So, of course, Abdu'l-Baha, as he was traveling America, he was, in some sense, echoing the writings of his own father, Baha'u'llah, who, in a number of messages that he said that he sent in the late 1860s to Queen Victoria, to the Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, to Napoleon, to the Tsar in Russia, to the Sultan in Turkey, to the Shah in Persia, and to other world leaders, in those messages he would repeatedly come back to the issue of the responsibility that leaders had, you know, for the poor, for the downtrodden. He said that ultimately God would judge these leaders by the extent to which, through the power and their policies, they would have done things to lighten the burden of poverty on the very poor. Baha'u'llah was visited in prison in 1890 by Edward Brown, who was a very famous Orientalist. He's a professor and fellow from Pembroke College in Cambridge, and somebody, you know, who had had a stellar career as an Orientalist. He spoke Persian, he spoke Arabic. He had a sort of great reputation in the academic community because of the travels that he had done for many years in that part of the world. So, you know, he was fully conversant with the culture and the politics and so on. And so in this capacity, as somebody who was intimately familiar with the history of the region, you know, he visited Baha'u'llah because he had taken a great interest in the history of the development of the Baha'i community. And in that meeting, Baha'u'llah said to him, however, we see your kings and rulers spending their treasures more in means for the destruction of the human race than in that which would confer happiness to humanity. Right? And I find these words very powerful. I mean, maybe because I'm an economist, right? And so this is essentially a statement about waste of resources, right? About kings and rulers essentially using resources, tax revenue, for, you know, building up military establishments and propping up armies and investing in weapons which eventually will be used only to destroy other people, right? He's lamenting that. And he's saying, rather than that which would conduce to the happiness of mankind. And you then could ask, what did he mean by that? You know, what is conducive to the happiness of mankind? And of course, Edward Brown doesn't say, maybe the subject did not come up in the discussion, maybe he did not elaborate, but this is where context is important. If you look at other writings, if you look at other things that he said and he wrote about, you know exactly what he meant by that which would confer happiness to mankind. And in fact, his son, Abdu'l-Baha, made that very clear in a treatise that he wrote, that he had already written, you know, some 15 years before, in 1875, where he talks, for instance, about the expansion of the frontiers of knowledge. This treatise that Abdu'l-Baha wrote in 1875 was essentially a kind of a statement about what are the priorities for economic and social development. You know, what should governments and policymakers focus on? And one of the areas that he wanted governments to focus on great attention was, he said, the expansion of the frontiers of knowledge, skills, knowledge accumulation, the acquisition of techniques and technologies. That was absolutely fundamental for development. And that, it seems to me, is one of the things that Baha'u'llah meant when he said, that which would be conducive to the happiness of mankind. Now, let me say a little bit about solutions. That's the third part of my presentation. And I will break up this into two parts quickly. I want to say about the solutions that were proposed by Abdu'l-Baha himself as he was traveling through America. He wasn't just raising the issue of the need to narrow income differentials, to eliminate or reduce the extremes of wealth and poverty, but he actually was making very specific, very sensible, in some cases very revolutionary proposals and suggestions. And then after I do that, I want to say a few words about, how has that debate evolved over the last, 100 years, and what are people like me and others, economists and experts, suggesting as possible solutions. First, Abdu'l-Baha talked about the need to introduce systems of progressive taxation. I find that really quite extraordinary, because if you go back to 1912, the tax systems of most rich countries were very, very primitive. And you mean, what did he mean by progressive taxation? Well, progressive taxation is a system whereby, as your income rises, the tax rate that gets applied to your rising levels of income rises, right? As opposed to a flat tax. Estonia, Russia, some countries in Central and Eastern Europe have a flat tax, where if you earn 10,000 New Zealand dollars, you pay 13%. If you earn $1 million New Zealand dollars, you pay 13%. That's a flat tax. Everybody pays the same rate. That's not progressive taxation. Progressive taxation is what probably I assume you have here in New Zealand, and they have it in the US, and they have it in most of the countries of the OECD, which is basically that the tax rate applied to higher levels of income rises, right? And it's a way of introducing a degree of equity. The idea is essentially that the very well off, the very rich, should contribute more than those at the other end of the income distribution. For me, it's very touching to see how Abdu'l-Baha, remember 1912, not 2018, when you have Excel spreadsheets and you have all the technological supports, gives several examples where he explains the principle of progressive taxation. And he says, if somebody makes so much money, then for the first, 1,000 units of the currency, you apply this tax rates, but if, for the next, you apply higher, and so on and so forth. And you can, reading that description, you know immediately that is progressive taxation. Now, so that was one idea. Then he speaks about one aspect which perhaps you might say, well, what does that have to do with income inequality? But if you begin to meditate and reflect on it, you realize that it is very much at the center of the debate. He spoke of the need to have a well-trained civil service and people working in government and formulating policies, who would be educated and have, the highest degree of knowledge and expertise. And the idea essentially was that when you have that, then you have a group of people that are going to be able to formulate policies and are going to be able to, serve the voters and the broader public in a much better way. Number one. And number two, he emphasized very strongly the issue of integrity and honesty in the discharge of one's public duties as a public servant, as a government official, as a minister, and so on. This issue of corruption, the misuse of power for private ends is something that he spoke very, very strongly against. And again, as an economist, we have learned so much in the last 100 years about the repercussions and the consequences of corruption that I can understand retrospectively why he put so much emphasis on it. Corruption has, we have a number of studies, including some which I have done myself and which are on my website. We know that corruption, for instance, reduces economic growth. We know that corruption reduces government revenue and therefore undermines the ability of the government to step in and fulfill other responsibilities in education and infrastructure and public health in other areas. Corruption creates uncertainty. It actually worsens income inequality, and it has a number of different other different repercussions. You know, there's a vast literature. I won't bore you with it, but Abdu'l-Baha, in addressing this issue of income inequality, thinks that addressing the question of corruption is absolutely essential, because where corruption is prevalent, it will undermine the credibility of the government, and it will undermine the ability of the government to actually address the problem of income inequality. Then he talks about profit sharing. Again, this is extraordinary. This is 1913. Let me share with you just a quote from him. He says, owners should share their incomes with their employees, that the employees may receive, beside their wages, some of the general income of the factory, so that the employee may strive with his soul in the work. Abdu'l-Baha is saying that rather than have a system in which the interests of the capitalists or the owners are completely opposed to the interests of the workers, and there is actually an incentive for the owners to exploit the workers and pay them as little as possible and to make them work as many hours as possible, to the point that average life expectancy in a coal mine in England was, 35 years. Right? He's saying, through profit sharing, what you do is you align the interests of the owners and the workers, right? Because then the workers will not just get a salary, they will be shareholders in the company. And therefore they will want to invest, and they will want to put a lot more effort. And the long-term viability of the company becomes internalized as something that is actually that benefits them as well, right? Rather than having capital and labor opposed, and fighting it out through the government. Usually labor losing, because the capitalists and the owners, they can bribe government officials to cook the laws in a way that will be to the detriment of the workers, right? So he thought that profit sharing would align these interests much more in a much better way. And I think that was a brilliant insight. And then the fourth area, which I will introduce by giving you an example, it's my indirect way of bringing to the idea that he was elaborating. If you are born in Norway, what are your prospects as a human being? Just let's think a little bit. What is average life expectancy? No, what is infant mortality in Norway? Is it high or low? Very low. One of the lowest in the world, right? So if you're born in Norway, essentially, what is the probability that you will reach the age of 1 or the age of 5? Very high, right? What is the probability that you will receive a education and that you will be trained, and that if you're talented, if you have ambition, that the system will actually allow you to get the skills and so on? Very high, very high. If you are born in Norway, what is the likelihood that your government is going to be able to fulfill its obligations to you once you retire and you have to earn your pension, and you have to rely on government services such as medical aid and so on, health and so on? Very, very high. Why? Because Norway is a country with 5 million people, and the government has saved $1 trillion from the sales of gas and oil during the last 20 years, which has stashed away and has invested, so that when you become 65 and you retire, they will be able to pay for your entitlements. All right. If you are born in Burundi or in Sierra Leone or in many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, what is the likelihood that you will reach the age of 1 or 5? Much lower, much lower. These countries, we have made progress the world over in reducing infant mortality, but that's the average. In many countries in Africa, infant mortality is sky high. And so if you are born in one of these countries, the probability that you will reach the age of 1 or 5 is much lower than it is in Norway. What about education? Well, again, education is poor quality, and not everybody makes it to school, and certainly not everybody makes it to tertiary education, university, and higher education and so on. Furthermore, these countries have other problems. the incidence of infectious diseases and other kinds of illnesses are much higher. You know, we have data on IQ, average IQ for more than 150 countries. Where do you think are the highest IQs in the world? Which countries? Give me 3 or 4 countries that have the highest IQs in the world. Singapore, Korea, Sweden, Japan. What is common to all these countries? High income, rich, wealthy countries, right? I haven't mentioned the IQ in New Zealand, not because, basically because I don't know the data, all right? Otherwise, I would have lumped you together with Korea and Singapore and so on. And you may well be there. You may well be there because New Zealand is a very high income country, of course. What do you think is the average IQ of countries in sub-Saharan Africa? It's much lower. It pains me to say this, but it is much lower because of these limitations, because of illnesses, because many small children suffer from diarrhea when they're in their first year, and this appears to be lethal for the development of the brain. And so, as you can see, you know, there is a kind of a dramatic profile, you know, for these two citizens of these two countries. Now, why do I mention this? Essentially to raise the following question: do you think this is fair? I mean, do you feel comfortable with this idea? Do you think that, well, you know, this is such as the world, you know, let's not give much thought to it, you know, this is the world in which we live, and so be it? No, I mean, there is a side of me that says, no, there is some fundamental inequity here. There is something that we need to do something about, that needs to be addressed in some fundamental way, so that in the future, in some kind of long-term future, your opportunities in life will not be a function of something that, after all, is an accident of history. Did you get to choose your parents? Did anybody in this room get to choose their parents? I was born in Bolivia, but if I had been given a choice, I would have preferred to be born in Norway, to be frank. Right? But that choice was not given to me, right? And not that I hold against my parents that they conceived me in Bolivia, because in their case, it wasn't their choice either to be born in Bolivia, correct? So now, why am I discussing this at length? Because when Abdu'l-Baha was traveling in America, he was saying that as part of this rethinking of the social order, we should think of introducing a system that would essentially provide for the basic necessities of people the world over, independently of whether they were born in Norway or they were born in Burundi. He didn't say Norway or Burundi, I'm interpreting that, I'm just, you know, telling you. And this idea, which he alluded to in his public presentations, interestingly enough, 100 years later, is now at the center of a very, very heated, interesting, fascinating debate between economists and policymakers in many parts of the world. And in fact, they have even coined a term for it, which is called universal basic income, right? That some countries are saying, and some policymakers and some thinkers are saying, we should eventually move to a system where people are guaranteed the basics, regardless of where they're born, right? And this is an idea that is not free of controversy because you know, as you can see, economists always see, you know, both sides of an issue. There are people who will say, no, you don't want to have universal income because you're going to create a nation of people who are going to be dependent and lazy, and you're going to deprive them of the incentive to work and to strive and to, you know, manifest and display efforts and so on. Or there are people who say, you know, you can't, it's a silly idea, it's an utopia because you could never afford it. Countries would never have enough resources to provide everybody with a basic level of income and so on. And here, let me just take a couple of minutes to give you a very fascinating example of a kind of experiment. I'm putting the word experiment in quotes because it wasn't thought of as an experiment, but it turned out to be a bit of a natural experiment after the fact. And the story goes as follows. There is an Indian reservation in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina, that has a few thousand Native Americans. And a few, 20 years ago or so, they opened up a casino because the natives in the United States, don't ask me why, I don't know the full story. They have certain rights to open up gambling sort of enterprises. And so a casino was set up in the reservation. And the casino, because gambling is an addiction, turned out to be quite profitable. And so at some point, the elders of the reservation were confronted with the question of what do we do with this money? And so very sensibly what they decided to do is we're going to distribute these profits to every man, woman, and child in the reservation in an equal amount. So a family of 5 would get 5 times the subsidy, a family of 3 would get 3 times the subsidy, everybody got the same amount of money. And so in a way, because the casino turned out to be profitable and then another one was opened later on, the profits began to grow, and therefore the distribution that was made of the profits began to grow as well over time. At which point, these enterprising professors from Duke University, which is a very fine university located in North Carolina, decided, well, why don't we look what has happened in the meantime, right? This subsidy had been going on for a number of years. And so they went and they began to look at the data because, and this is where the word experiment comes in, because they had data before the subsidy was introduced and of course the data that evolved afterwards. And what they discovered was absolutely fascinating. The incidence of domestic violence was way down. Graduation rates for high school students was way up. Incidence of alcoholism and drug abuse was way down. There were a number of instances of entrepreneurship, members of the reservation creating small businesses and essentially taking the initiative to generate additional wealth and income for their families. A number of members of the reservation had done something that very few people had done in the past, which was basically to leave the reservation, enroll in a school, and get a university education, right? And so this was really quite an eye-opening experience because it illustrates a little bit the idea that, number one, when people are given a certain level of income, support, it doesn't automatically follow that they all become lazy and they sit in front of the television set, drinking beer and watching 7 hours of television. Actually, no. Many of these people were using the money, for self-improvement, for improving their families. Furthermore, it also illustrates an additional point, which is that maybe some of the drug addiction and the alcoholism and the incidence of domestic violence and so forth, maybe that was partly a result of poverty, of this, what Abdul Baha said, the stresses and the misery that comes together with being very poor, right? Which then spills over into violence, into drug addiction, hopelessness, and so on. When you have a little income which you get on a regular basis, that hopelessness is perhaps mitigated and you have a sense of purpose and you can use that income for self-improvement, right? So this illustrates in a very interesting way this debate about universal basic income. I am a firm believer in this idea, and as you can imagine, I have answers, to the critics who have alluded to some of these other problems, such as unaffordability and so on. This is a very vast subject, and I don't want to dwell on this, and I do want to conclude in a few minutes. Then finally, very quickly in passing, what about other things? What are other solutions which Abdul Baha did not talk about, but which are relevant today? Because of course the world has changed. 100 years have gone by, and there are other instruments that we have developed and that can be done, and that unfortunately we're not doing, even though they're there, and which is the reason why the problem of inequality has become so bad. It is not that it is inevitable. It is just that there are instruments that are available for us that we're not using, and it's for that reason that inequality has worsened. And let me quickly mention 2 or 3. One. I had an interview yesterday with your Radio New Zealand, is it? Radio New Zealand? Mark, are you here? Yeah, it was Radio New Zealand, right? Yes. Yes. And the lady who interviewed me raised one aspect. We were talking a little bit about measures of human welfare. And sort of it was kind of a spirited discussion. And at one point during the discussion, I thought that I would mention a study that was done in the IMF in 2015, 3 years ago. And this study calculated the cost of energy subsidies. You know, governments everywhere in the world subsidize energy. Maybe not in New Zealand. The rich countries tend to be better at this, but in many parts of the world, you know, my own country is a very good example. They subsidize gasoline, they subsidize electricity, natural gas, carbon, mainly. These are the 4 big ticket items. And the IMF estimated that the cost of these subsidies is something like $5.3 trillion annually, right? Which is about 6.5% of world GNP. Right? In other words, it's an astronomical sum that governments are essentially spending to encourage you to drive more than you would otherwise do, or to basically you know, use more energy or more natural gas and so on. And furthermore, what they were able to show is that these subsidies make income distribution worse. Why? Why do you think they make income distribution worse? Because the benefits of the subsidy largely go to the people at the upper end of the distribution. Who benefits from the gasoline subsidy in India? Is it the poor, illiterate women living in the villages? Is it the middle class driving cars in New Delhi? Yes, of course, they are the beneficiaries of the subsidy, right? So the IMF calculated that 60% of the benefits go to the 20% top of the income distribution. Right? Now, that is a mindlessly idiotic public policy. I mean, I have no other way to describe it. Furthermore, the IMF said, if subsidies were eliminated, emissions of global warming gases would drop by 20% the world over. In other words, these subsidies are making income distribution worse, and they are accelerating climate change. If all of us got together for 12 hours and we wanted to come up with a worse public policy, something more idiotic, it would be difficult to match this one, right? Right? All right. So there is one area where, you know, we're spending vast resources that are basically making a problem that we have talked about tonight worse. Second, at the World Bank we have done a lot of work on gender inequality, and one of the studies that was actually put together by one of my teams during the last several years, and that was in some sense the inspiration for this book that has just come out, which I have written with Bahia Nashchabani, a very dear Baha'i friend living in Europe, called Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All. Countries are using the law to, you know, the constitution, the civil code, the family law, the tax code, the labor code, they're using it and have been using it already for many decades to discriminate against women, you know, to undermine her property rights, to put constraints on her to access the job market and so on. And what we have discovered is that the countries that have less restrictions in the law have better income profile, better income distribution profile. And in a sense, you know, that's intuitive. If you discriminate against half of the population, if you put all kinds of constraints on her ability to contribute to the economy, of course it's going to worsen income distribution, income inequality. I'll give you a little anecdote, just by way of an example. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of these restrictions and discriminations against women across the planet. But I was in Moscow exactly 2 years ago, and I was having a meeting with the senior minister in charge of economic policy in the country. And towards the end of a kind of a 1 hour long meeting, he turns to me and he says, what else can we do in Russia to improve the quality of the business environment? And that, for him, that was a very important question, and that is what we had been discussing for the previous hour. Because Russia, 2 years ago, and still remains the case today, is under sanctions. Economic growth has collapsed. It's very, very low for the last several years. It's a country that is highly dependent on energy, oil, and oil prices at that time were much lower than they had been in previous years. And so, there was this sense that we need to do something about it, and they had come up with the idea that improving the quality of the business environment for the private sector, improving the investment climate, as we say, was very important. And that is why he said, what else? We had been discussing the kinds of things they can do, and he said, what else can we do to improve business environment conditions in Russia? And I was prepared for that question. And I said, I won't mention his name because some of you might put this in Facebook or something and then get me in trouble. Right? Minister, what about eliminating some of the 456 job prohibitions that you have in the Russian Federation against women? And he looks at me, and I don't exaggerate, his jaw drops, and he says, give me an example, in a slightly sort of aggressive way. And I said, well, Minister, you know very well, women cannot drive your metros. Russia has a very well-developed, very efficient system of, the tube, as they call it in England. And of course, my wife and I lived in Moscow for many years. We never ever saw a woman driver. All the drivers are men. And so he immediately realized that I got him. That was one example. He asked for an example. I had an example. Although, of course, I had a folder in front of me, and I opened the folder and I looked at him, and I think he realized that if needed, I could give him 455 other examples, right? So he didn't say, give me another example, right? But then he said, well, that's a legacy of the Soviet Union, at which point, if I had been naughty, I would have said, but Minister, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, 25 years ago, right? So let's not talk about a legacy. Why are they still in the books? Why are they still these restrictions? And then he went to the second line of defense in these situations, which is, many of these restrictions were introduced to protect women, right? So women, to protect you, have identified 456 occupations where you cannot work, which just happen to be some of the choicest, highest paid jobs in the country, right? And of course, what do you think is the wage gap between men and women in Russia? It's huge, right? Do you think that these restrictions improve or worsen income inequality? They worsen income inequality. They limit the opportunities for half of the population, right? So here you have an example that comes from the gender space. It is one of the reasons why we Baha'is are so identified with the concept of gender equality, because ultimately it has an economic dimension, and these are some of the issues that we talked about in this book. And then finally, to conclude, and I think I have said 3 times already to conclude, so this is my last one. We live in a world in which we have no collective security. When the United Nations was created in 1945, it was called upon to create a context of peace and security so that we could have prosperity and stability. And it has unfortunately failed in that respect. And since 1945, we have had dozens and dozens of millions of people who have died in multiple wars. And as a result of this, the process of social and economic development has been delayed and has been postponed in ways that we could have made much more progress. Now, what do I mean by we have no system of collective security? Basically that we have 193 members of the United Nations, all of which feel that they have to spend money in defense, in propping up military establishments, in spending, creating, financing armies and navies and air forces and so on, because they have to protect themselves against perceived or very often imaginary threats. And the amounts of money that are spent are astronomical. It's a little bit like energy subsidization, except perhaps in some sense worse, right? Because while some people die as a result of energy subsidies, because they contribute to pollution, and pollution is killing more and more people, right? In the case of weapons and militaries and so on, the number of casualties is much, much higher, right? And so here you have another area, a large pocket of resources, which in a different kind of political system could be redirected to development and could be redirected to address the problem of income inequality. So when my colleagues tell me, oh, this idea of universal basic income is unaffordable, I say, well, wait a minute. What about the $5.5 trillion which we're spending every year on energy subsidization? And what about the multiple $1 trillion that we're spending every year on weapons and defense and so-called security, right? And so on, right? So we need to be honest about these arguments. And in the Baha'i faith, we very much argue that one of the reasons why we want to move to a system of collective security is because it will empower us to redirect those resources to real human development and to that which will be conducive to the happiness of mankind, including the narrowing of income differentials. Thank you very much.